to Lesson 6, Examine the Elements. Of course, if you are learning how to create a tabletop board game by watching and listening to my lessons from Lesson 1 up to now, then I hope that you would consider going to my homepage and clicking on the subscribe button. And then, of course, telling all your family and friends about my Create Your Own Tabletop Board Game YouTube channel. So I want to welcome you to Examine the Elements. So if you have been following me from Lesson 1 up till now, then you should have a game board that has a unique and distinctive track that you created. And you should have your start written on a space, and you should have the word home written on a space. Your start space is where everyone puts their pawn to begin the game, and your home space is where the first player to reach home wins the game. Now, your track is blank, it's empty, because we haven't talked about elements that will populate your track. So that's what we want to look at now. Examine the elements. Now what I want to do is I want to use my board game called Backtrack, and let's take a look at my game board that will give you an idea of how I use my elements to make my tabletop board game challenging to players. So types of elements: numbers, colors, letters. Challenge of the elements: send players backtracking, detain players, name your game using elements. Use how the elements play to name your game, and use a specific element to name your game. So, the types of elements that you can use on your track to make your board game challenging are numbers, colors, letters, and there's so many more. But I'm using my Backtrack tabletop board game to show you the 3 elements that I've used on my track: numbers, colors, and letters. So I want to take a time to show you my game board so you can visually see what I'm referring to when I say numbers, colors, and letters that I use on my track. So let's take a look at the numbers. So there's number 5, number 15, 10, 3, 13, 7, 24, 4, 8, 32, 23, number 2, and number 33. And each time that you land on a number, it will cause you to backtrack. Now let's look at the colors: black, green, brown, blue. And you can see I have these 4 colors around my track 3 times. These sets of colors are on my track 3 times. So as you can see it, black, green, brown, blue, then black, green, brown, blue, and then black, green, brown, and blue. And thirdly, letters. I have 1 letter on my track, and it's an X. And if you land on X, it detains you where you are, and you cannot leave the X space unless you roll a certain number. So as you can see, I have 4 X's and 4 different places on my track. So going back to the board, numbers, colors, letters are the types of elements that I use on my track to make my tabletop board game called Backtrack challenging to all players. So we're going to get more specific in other elements that you can use on your track to make your tabletop board game fun, addictive, and challenging. Now, number 2, challenge of the elements. In other words, how does your elements challenge your players? Now, if you look at my Backtrack tabletop board game, my elements that I have on my track challenge my players by sending players backtracking and detaining players. So, as I said earlier, if you land on a number or a color, it's going to send players backtracking. The whole point of my board game is to send your opponent backtracking while you try to move forward to home and win the game. So when you land on a number, you backtrack. When you land on a color, whichever color you land on, whichever player has that color draws a card, and every time you draw a card, on that card, some kind of way it's going to tell you that you have to backtrack. Letters, the X, when you land on the X, you have to stay on the X and you can't get off the X until you roll a certain number, and if you roll that number, then you can move off the X. So everything here, numbers, colors, letters, it either keeps you where you are, but mostly it makes you backtrack. You have to go backwards. So types of elements on my board game are numbers, colors, and letters. And there's going to be a lot more that we're going to talk about, some more elements that you can put on your track. Number 2, challenge of the elements. The elements that I have on my track challenges all the players by sending them backtracking or detaining players. Now let's look at number 3. Name your game using elements. Sometimes when you're creating your tabletop board game, you won't be able to think about a name to go with your game. So you can name your game using elements that you're using on your track. Use how the elements play to name your game. Use a specific element to name your game. So in other words, I used how elements play on my track to name my game. So in other words, when a person lands on a number, they go backwards. If they land on a color, their opponent draws a card, and on that card, the playing card, it will tell the opponent that they have to backtrack. So these two elements, numbers and colors, will cause you to backtrack, and this letter, the X on my game board, on my track, when you land on it, it detains you. So I use the numbers and the colors, and I figured, well, the numbers and the colors send players going backwards. So I came up with the name Backtrack. That's how I came up. I used how the elements play to make your game. So I used how the numbers and the colors play on my track to name my game. So in other words, instead of calling my board game backwards, I called it Backtrack. All right, name your game using elements. So we did A, use how the elements play to name your game. Now B, use a specific element to name your game. So you can use a specific element to name your game. Let's say you use a number 3. You can call your board game 3, or you can use the Spanish word 3 or the Latin word 3. You get what I'm trying to say about how to name your game? So look at a specific element and see how you can rename that element or something specific about your element. So in other words, use a specific element to name your game. So remember I said number 3? Let's say on your track, you have a number 3 on your track in a specific way. Like, for an example, my letter. The 4 X's on my track, those 4 X's stand out. So I could have named my board game X for an example. So if you're using your element in a certain way, in a certain manner, see if you could use that element as a name to name your game. But you want to make sure that your element goes with the gameplay, and that your gameplay goes with the naming. Well, let me say that again. You want to make sure that the element that you're using to name your game, that how you play the game matches up with the name of your game. Okay? So, lesson 6, examine the elements. Type of elements that you can use on your track are numbers, colors, and letters. And there are a lot more that you can use on your track, and we'll talk about that on another video. Challenge of the elements. How does your elements that you're using on your track challenge your players. And number 3, you can name your game using elements as I showed you here in A and B. And I use my board game Backtrack as an example. That most of the elements on my track causes players to go backwards. Thus the name of my board game, I called it Backtrack. So lesson 6, at this point, before you start lesson 6, you should, if you followed, again, my lessons from lesson 1 till now, you should have a game board set up already with your track, a distinctive and unique track route that you created on your own, and you should have written start on it, and you should have written home on it, and of course the rest of your track is blank because we haven't gotten to the elements yet. So I just wanted you to examine the elements. In other words, let's take a closer look at the elements and how they're used on the track as I showed you for my board game Backtrack. So thanks everyone for watching this video, examine the elements, and I hope that you will continue with me to watch video lesson 7 in regards to learning more about the elements that you're about to put on your track. Thanks everyone for watching.